Hello and welcome, Charlotte.
Hi, Kimberly. How are you?
I'm so good. Thanks for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you. And I've got like my first question where I just really want to dive in. And of course, my notes are to my right. So my apologies for taking my eyes off you. But tell us about your work as a writer, right? A vintage fashion expert, which I love, a podcast host, and founder of Shea Charlotte Vintage. So you got a lot going on. So tell us about this.
Well, I just describe myself first and foremost as a writer because that really is like my job, and I feel like it's my vocation, So yes, I'm a writer, but I'm also a vintage fashion expert, and a lot of my writing is about vintage. And I used to have a vintage shop called Shea Charlotte Vintage, which I've transformed into a podcast. I call it like a vintage media brand. And then that links in with the book I have coming out later this year. So yeah, that is what I do. And it means at the moment I can be remote. So I'm working, traveling. And I actually only came to this like relatively recently. I used to be an interior designer for most of my 20s. And I left that career when I was 27 and have like followed my heart ever since. So not that I don't love interiors, I do, but I feel much more aligned and authentic now with what I'm doing.
Well, you know what I love about this, and our listeners really like talking about this too, but it's transitions, right? So what took you from interior design to like this media, bit that you're doing now? Because I think a lot of listeners and many people are like, oh, I've been doing this for so long. I'm good at it, but it's just not my passion anymore. So tell us about how that transition went, because that's not always smooth.
No, well, I've just spent summer, and by summer, I mean Southern Hemisphere summer, because you can hear my accent. I'm from New Zealand originally, but I just spent the summer at my parents' house, which I've never really done. I left home when I was 17, so it had been like a really long time to do something like that. But I was going through my old school books when I was there. And basically, like, I was always like a really creative person and very into writing and drawing. And one thing with the book I have coming out, I illustrated it as well, which is kind of fabulous. But I think in that I was this creative person, but I sort of decided on interior design. I'd worked in fashion for a little bit before that, because I sort of thought interiors was like creative, but it was also stable and, somewhat kind of contained or something. So it was me kind of conforming in a weird sort of way. And I definitely don't regret it. It was a fantastic place to learn. And I think also being a trained designer is a really good skill because it's all about problem solving. So you can apply that to anything you do. But what had happened was I was working in this role and I'd moved from Sydney to Melbourne. I'm professionally based in Australia. And I'd moved there for a job and I was running a little furniture brand. And it was like a really sweet brand. I loved my boss and my colleagues. It was part of a greater like interior design firm. And my boss and I like had a big chat one day, and basically I'd worked in lots of small businesses. And I'd done a lot of writing as I'd gone, because in small businesses, you end up doing like more than your role. So, so I'd written like the newsletter and the blog and like that kind of stuff. She and I just had a chat one day and she was like, I think you're like a better writer than you are anything else. And I was like, me too. And I knew I had to leave. I had like a gut feeling, like kind of soul calling. And she was so supportive. She like sort of wished me well. We figured out a plan on like how I would exit, and I had like contracting work lined up to ease the transition. I think that's the thing. You do need to like bridge it somehow, whether, you've saved or you have another role or you're kind of doing part-time this, part-time that. But I think with the pandemic too, because that was around the time of the pandemic, like just before we all went into lockdown. But I realized too, I had no responsibilities. I was young, and like, even though I felt a bit old to be changing careers in some ways, which is ridiculous, but like, I was like, now is the time I can do this. I can like jump off this cliff. So that is what happened. And then I started writing a blog, and then I opened my shop, and then it's all kind of gone from there. So yeah. Lots of transitioning, but like all for the better. I'm so happy I did it.
Yes, and I love this. And I think it's so important, the reminder, right? That yes, leap and the net will appear, but it's nice to have a little net, to make sure. And then also the recognition. I never thought of this. Interior design is about problem solving. So interesting.
Yeah.
And, that you started with a blog. I mean, that's actually, I started with a yoga studio, but then my next thing was a blog, then a podcast. And so, for listeners that are just curious about like, well, how do I kind of get going? This idea of beginning to write about what it is you're so passionate about, I think is a really great idea. So thank you.
No worries. Well, I think, yeah, whether it's writing or sharing it somehow, like social media, YouTube, whatever the medium is for you, I think that's the way to get going for sure.
Well, so my next question is you were recently in Italy doing a residency, which sounds like super fabulous. And so tell us about that.
Yes, well, it's really weird, Kimberly, because I always feel like I always get to the goal, but I always do everything out of order on the way. I don't know why. This is just like what happens to me. But what had happened was I had my shop and that was going well, but I ended up having like a big life change. I had a big breakup, which I think spurs a lot of people, especially women, on do what they actually want. And so I had this vintage brand, but I was writing as well. And I sort of thought, I actually really want to apply myself and be like a proper writer and like start making this my career. And in that, I had a session with like a literary publicist, and she, at the end of it, she'd gone through my bio and she was like, "Oh, you lived in Sicily," because I'd lived in Sicily as a teenager as an exchange student. And she was like, "Oh, I know of this writer's residency in Sardinia. Like, you should apply for it." And this was at the end of 2021. And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I just like applied for it. I didn't really put much effort into it. I just kind of put some links and just like wrote a sincere but quick letter to these people who had this writer's residency. And a couple of weeks later, I got this email back from them and they were like, "Oh, hi, Charlotte. Your application was 6 weeks late." And I was like, "Oh God, how embarrassing." And then they were like, "But someone's just pulled out and would like you to come instead." And what I'd proposed in that is that I would finish a book there and then skip to the day I left for Italy, was the day I signed my book deal. So it was definitely meant to be. And that was kind of a jumpy off the cliff moment. And I would have had plenty to write about had I not had that book deal, or I would have been writing it anyway. But yeah, that's how it came about. So all of last year, I sort of knew that I was going there and that was like my aim, but I was doing all sorts of things along the way. And then it ended up that I did finish my manuscript there. So it was amazing. And it was in rural Sardinia near a blue zone, that study. So that was extraordinary. And yeah, it was the most amazing experience. And it's what's led me now to be in LA. So I've been traveling for a while. Yeah, when I was there, on the first day, and I flew to Milan from Melbourne. And then I met this American guy on that first day. And since then, yeah, I did 2 months initially, 2 months in New Zealand, and now I'm sort of halfway into a 2-month stint in LA. So that's what's happened out of that. Quite long, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I love how things just kind of come together and you're like, 6 weeks late, whatever, let's have you, which is beautiful. One of the things that you mentioned before we began recording was that, during all of this, you have been living out of a suitcase. And so someone who's into fashion and style, how is that possible? Like, I'd love to hear a little about your packing list, because a lot of my listeners really love the packing videos that I do and talking about like what goes into it. And I recently went to Paris for a week-long kind of art retreat, and I got everything in one carry-on, one rollerboard, which and a little bag that went over my shoulder and included my purse. I put my purse into that. So, but that was really impressive for me. So, and wasn't an expandable one either. So I'm curious for you, tell us a little bit about how you're getting through this.
Well, I've actually written an article about this for an Australian publication, which I'll send to you so you can link it to people so I can expand on that. But honestly, I really miss my clothes. Like I have dreams about them. I'm serious. So they're in storage in Melbourne at the moment, which is sad to think of them like hanging there. But in terms of packing though, I think my like greatest tricks are to bring things that are versatile. And I know that's quite obvious, but I also think things that are kind of low maintenance, the things that don't need to be dry cleaned, for example, things you can like easily wash. You don't necessarily have to iron them because that's the sort of stuff that when you're lugging it around, it can kind of hinder you, you know? And then I also think with things you can do to sort of like dress things up or down, it's all in accessories. So, I mean, I'm a vintage fashion expert and I love like big vintage earrings and things like that. So those are the sorts of things that I'll like add to a look if I'm like going out in the evening, but it's something I could probably wear during the day as well. So yeah, those are sort of my biggest tips. But I think that low maintenance thing is key because that is where a lot of people kind of waste space, so to speak. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love the idea of just dressing up and down, right? You take the same outfit that you could like take a ballet class in or go to a yoga class, go run errands, and then actually adding particular accessories and maybe in more layers, you're like, voila, here I am in this like outfit that's great for a cocktail party, which is really fun.
Yeah, that's the trick.
So tell us about what's blonde, blonde, not beige, right? Which is your blog. And I just love the name. So tell us like where that came from and what people can find on it.
Well, I mean, when I was an interior designer, like the kind of girls I work with and everything would all be like, oh, we hate beige. Like it's so boring. And what I sort of thought though in that, because, some beige is actually nice, it depends, but like blonde, I mean, I'm blonde, naturally. So it's like kind of the synonymous part with like how I look, but also blonde and beige are like the same color, but there's such a different sort of, there's such a different definition of the two and like a sort of different feeling, when you like say it or think it. So I sort of thought it's like an attitude to life, blonde, not beige. It's like it's the same thing, but if you have this positive attitude and like see the kind of fun and frivolity and effervescence and things, then, it's likely to be more enjoyable. So I think, so it's partly that like blonde and beige are the same color, but also because I'm blonde, so kind of, literally linked to who I am. So that is the name of my Substack. And that was the name of my blog that I'd done before. And that it's just kind of an attitude, but I use the Substack now as a platform to write the pieces I really want to write. I send out a weekly newsletter and like right now I'm in LA, so I'm sending out like a diary kind of long blog posts, but sometimes I write more like features on there. So it's just a place for me to explore things and share with my readers, and it allows me like direct access and no editorial intervention and all of that. So there's a lot of freedom in it, which I really love. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I like that because you're right. They are same-ish colors, right? But it's like,
yeah,
how do you get that flair?
Than that,
right. Yeah. Well, and so tell us on why you decided to transform your brand, right, from a shop to a show and how that's going.
Well, I mean, I feel like comfortable sharing this, but I had been working on this shop and I was getting quite like physically exhausted. I have endometriosis. It's quite bad. Although I'm working on it now, it's actually getting a lot better, but I was finding it very like difficult to keep up with like the physical demands of having a vintage shop because it's incredibly labor intensive, like lugging around a lot of clothing, even though it's like really fun. Like there's so much about it I miss, but I had this audience and the goal of the shop was always to get more people wearing more vintage. And I thought, how could I like use that same ethos and the same brand, carry it over and keep sharing with these people that are following? And because I was writing a lot, I sort of thought I could do like a podcast to go with that. And the podcast also called Charlotte Vintage. It's all about like sharing stories of people's vintage wardrobes and their thrifting tales and their secondhand style and it's all a bid to inspire people, basically, just to get into it and to take away from the stigma. I think that there's certainly a lot more like cyclical fashion now available, but I think that there's still this like thought around it for a lot of people where it kind of like, like it smells and it's old or it's something and people would often say to me when I had a shop was, what if someone died in this? And I was like, I'm sure it would be to say over here, but fair enough. But yeah, it's to break all that down and also just break down that barrier to fashion, because I think sometimes it can be a little bit exclusive in its feeling. And I don't think it should be that way. I think everyone should be able to take part in it and have fun with it and be able to find their style by wearing more of it. So it's the same kind of mission, but it works a lot better with my life. And it actually, in many ways I enjoy it more. I still do vintage markets and stuff when my feet are on the ground, not when I'm living out of a suitcase. And that's really fun. And that kind of gives me that fix. But yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah. I mean, having a retail store, oh my goodness, that's like so much work.
Yes. Yeah. It was a lot of work and we did like lots of pop-ups but I'm really glad I did it again. Like, I don't think I could be doing this now without having done that. So it was worth it and an integral part of this whole brand. So yeah.
Well, so tell us about, for any listeners who might be confused about vintage, it's my understanding it's 20 years old. So if you could just define vintage and give any tips on blending vintage with their everyday style.
Well, there's debate about whether it's got to be 20 years old or 30 years old. And I think the trick with vintage is to learn the rules, but then disregard them because there shouldn't be any rules. Do you know what I mean? So whether it's, 29 years old or 31 years old, regardless, if you like the piece and it resonates for whatever reason, you should, try and incorporate it. I think, again, like it's about sort of demystifying it all. And it's like, if you go into a thrift store or a more curated vintage boutique, just use that attitude of like, see it, like it, buy it. And if you like it and it resonates, you'll definitely be able to use it in your wardrobe. And I think some people get put off by like the maintenance of vintage and cleaning it and all of that stuff. But all you need is like a trusted dry cleaner if you need to like swap out a zip or whatever it may be, or also like learning to hand wash things properly, which is actually really easy. And there are brands like the Laundress, which have like a beautiful product range, which you can use for these specific fabrics and stuff. Like that's all you need to do. It's actually really simple. And then it's sustainable, it's stylish, and it's more unique. So, the goal is, or rather the like reward is so much greater than like having to take care of it a little bit more. So I think that's the thing. It's sort of learning these rules, but then disregarding them and just tuning into your own style. And then it will just flow into your wardrobe. You don't need to think about it too hard.
Yeah. Just notice like what you're drawn to and grab it.
What's the worst that can happen? You can just redonate it or give it to someone, sell it, whatever it may be. Yeah.
Totally. Totally. Well, tell us about this new book of yours. I've got the title, How to Be Fabulous, a guide to finding your secondhand style. So what will we find inside of this whenever it's out?
So I'm working on it right now, but basically it kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about in terms of vintage. It's like how to find your authentic style, how to work within any budget, because budgets are cyclical in themselves. Like they're not linear, and there will be times in your life where you are able to spend more or you need to spend less, whatever it is, on clothes, but you can use secondhand style to your advantage in that sense. And then also where to actually find really good vintage clothing. I think America has amazing vintage clothing. It's like mecca for it. But so you guys are lucky. But a lot of people don't kind of know where to start. So it's all about breaking it down in a really like linear fashion. So yeah, that will be out later this year. And I'm really excited for it. And I illustrated it as well, as I said before, which is crazy to me.
That's amazing because, that's like a whole other animal. So I'm so impressed.
Well, I'm certainly an amateur, but it was my lockdown hobby. So to be able to use it in a kind of like, tangible sense, it's amazing. Yeah.
Any favorite tips on how you'd encourage listeners to find their secondhand style, or even like favorite shops and maybe online since people live in so many different cities?
Well, I mean, I know that the interface has always been a bit clunky, but I do think eBay is extraordinary. Like the dress I'm wearing right now, it's Vivienne Westwood, but I bought it on eBay. But yeah, there's so much you can find on eBay. You can literally find anything, but it's a matter of getting your search terms right and like where to expand in your descriptions and where to just kind of be really uniform. So actually in the book, I break that down quite thoroughly. But the same can be applied to Etsy, which has a more sort of boutique marketplace interface. But I also think wherever you live, it's worth going to a vintage market or whatever it may be and like forming relationships with the vintage dealers near you because they can help you find more pieces. And same even with thrift stores, it's like getting to know that thrift store, like when do the pieces get put out? Is it constantly or is it every Tuesday morning? And, kind of befriending the people who volunteer there can be advantageous, but also, it kind of brings joy to the experience and adds to that community feeling, which I think is really nice about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's even like in New York, I'm sure this is everywhere, but some really great flea markets where I found fun, like vintage handbags or vintage luggage suitcases, and hat boxes. So
So,
cute.
yeah, I love hat boxes. They're
I love
just,
them
I
too.
know they're the best actually for storage because they're so pretty. So you
Mhm.
can like proudly display them, but you can actually fit a lot in them. Yeah.
So cute. Well, so my last question for you is the name of the podcast, right? Is Tranquility du Jour. And so I'm wondering, how do you find tranquility in your everyday, especially while living out of your suitcase and being across the world from where you are from?
Yes. Well, I'm very happy to be here, but there have been moments where I've felt quite unsettled, probably because, it's a lot when it's not expected. But actually, I think my trick to tranquility and happiness is going with the flow. And I think that for some people, this thrives with more routine, but I've realized I actually don't. Like, I still am disciplined and I have things that I have to do every week and things I sort of want to do. But my attitude to it is like, I sort of tune into how I'm feeling and then go about it accordingly, if that makes sense. So even
Mhm.
this morning, I was supposed to do a yoga class, but I woke up feeling like really tired. So instead, my boyfriend does a lot of physiotherapy. He's a doctor, but he just like did this like treatment on my back and I feel so much better for it. I obviously have that luxury at the moment of having someone to be able to do that, but it's kind of tuning in and it's like, well, I didn't do yoga today, so I'll just do it tomorrow. And I'm still going to do, X amount of yoga classes this week. So it's kind of adhering to a bit of discipline, but having slow within that. That's my trick personally.
I love it. It's such a good reminder because even, with the best of intentions, it's like, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, but we have to be able to go with the flow because things come up. You wake up, you don't feel well, or, the weather is bad, or, whatever it is that's affecting what you want to do. And I think it's such a skill set to be able to go with the flow. So thank you for sharing that. It's a great reminder.
Yes. And actually, I went to a really good yoga class this week. And I'm saying this because I know you're a yoga person, but the instructor, there's been terrible rain in LA this week, like unseasonable, like unheard of. But he was talking about like thinking about the rain that was going through the gutters and like how it was like curving. It wasn't like going around the corner in a regimented way. And he was like, you've got to think of that slow in your yoga and flow in your life. So yeah, I'm like envisioning the hideous LA rain as I'm saying yes. But there are lessons everywhere.
There are lessons everywhere. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, and congrats on this like beautiful brand you've created and on your upcoming new book.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. And you inspire me completely. So thanks for having me on this podcast.
Thank you.